I never thought my final months as mayor would turn into a suburban battleground. After serving Oak Ridge for 2 terms, I was ready for a peaceful transition into retirement. No more late-night council meetings, no more budget crises, and definitely no more neighborhood disputes. That is, until I woke up one Saturday morning to find my driveway transformed into a public parking lot. Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know if your neighborhood has its own Karen causing headaches like mine did. My peaceful Saturday shattered when I glanced out my window to see unfamiliar cars filling my driveway, some even spilling onto my lawn. A professionally printed sign stood at the edge of my property. HOA community parking $5 per hour. Proceeds benefit neighborhood development. Someone had converted my private property into a commercial parking lot overnight without even a courtesy call. I found Karen Smith, our HOA president, directing an SUV onto my lawn. I'd kept city business separate from neighborhood politics during my tenure, distance that may have emboldened her. "Excuse me," I called out, maintaining my diplomatic tone. "What exactly is happening on my property?" Karen turned with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Dave. The HOA board voted to expand our community funding initiatives. Your driveway's location is perfect for paid parking, especially with the farmers market nearby. The proceeds will go toward our landscaping project." "Karen, this is my private property," I responded after counting to 5 in my head. "The HOA has no authority to convert it into a commercial venture without my consent. I need these cars removed immediately." Her smile returned with twice the wattage, but none of the warmth. "If you'd bothered to read the updated HOA bylaws, Section 5, Paragraph 12 states that the association can utilize residential exteriors for community benefit. It was in last month's newsletter." She waved her clipboard dismissively. "Besides, you're hardly home with all your important mayor business. But that's winding down soon, isn't it? I hear you're not even running again." Before I could respond appropriately, my phone chimed with a text from Karen, bizarrely standing right before me. "You're on your way out, Dave. Don't bother fighting this. The new administration will support HOA initiatives. Don't make enemies you can't afford." Looking up, I saw Karen watching me with that plastic smile and knowing glint. This wasn't just about parking. Something bigger was happening. Standing surrounded by strangers' vehicles on my own property, I realized my peaceful retirement transition had hit a major roadblock. For the first time in years, I felt that familiar fire ignite in my gut, the one that had driven me into public service. Karen had made a serious miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with a toothless, outgoing mayor. What she didn't realize was that until my replacement was sworn in, I still had every bit of my authority, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The following Monday morning found me at the HOA office, housed in a modest building at the edge of our neighborhood. I'd spent Sunday researching property laws and HOA regulations, refreshing my memory on the limits of their authority. Knowledge was power, and I wasn't about to walk into Karen's territory unprepared. The reception area was decorated with framed photos of neighborhood events and awards the HOA had received for community excellence, ironically several of which I had personally presented to them during my early days as mayor. The receptionist recognized me immediately, her eyes widening slightly as she fumbled with her phone. "Mayor Kingston, do you have an appointment with Miss Smith?" There was a nervousness to her tone that confirmed my suspicions. Whatever was happening wasn't just Karen going rogue. "No appointment necessary," I replied with the easy confidence that had helped me win 2 elections. "I'm sure she can spare a few minutes for the sitting mayor." Before the receptionist could respond, Karen emerged from her office, alerted by the commotion. She wore a tailored navy suit that screamed authority, a stark contrast to my casual button-down and khakis. I had deliberately dressed down. This wasn't an official mayoral visit, but a conversation between neighbors. "Dave," she said, my first name sounding like an insult in her clipped tone. "What a surprise! I was just about to call you about the tremendous success of our new parking initiative. We raised over $2,000 this weekend alone." Her voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone announcing lottery winners, but her eyes remained calculating. I maintained a pleasant expression as I gestured toward her office. "I'd love to hear all about it, Karen. Perhaps somewhere private?" For a moment I thought she might refuse, but appearances mattered too much to her. With a tight smile, she led me into a meticulously organized office, dominated by a large desk and a wall of community regulations bound in leather folders. "Coffee?" she offered, though she made no move toward the machine in the corner. I declined with a shake of my head. "I'll get right to the point, Karen. The HOA has no legal authority to convert private property into commercial space without the owner's consent. I've reviewed every bylaw, including your recent amendments, and found nothing that grants you this power. The cars need to be removed, the signs taken down, and any damage to my lawn repaired at the HOA's expense." Karen leaned back in her chair, unruffled by my demands. "Those bylaws were unanimously approved by the board, Dave. Section 5, paragraph 12 clearly states—" I cut her off, something I rarely did in professional settings, but this wasn't a negotiation. "I've read the document, Karen. That paragraph refers to community events hosted by homeowners who have volunteered their spaces, not unilateral appropriation of private property. What you've done is not just against HOA regulations, it's illegal." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, quickly replaced by something harder. "The community benefits from this arrangement, Dave. Isn't that what you've always preached? The greater good of Oak Ridge and all that campaign rhetoric? Besides, fighting this will only damage your legacy." The threat was thinly veiled, and it confirmed what I had suspected since seeing her text message. "This isn't really about parking revenue or community benefits, is it, Karen? Who put you up to this?" I asked, watching her reaction carefully. She straightened papers on her desk, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know what you're implying. The board made a decision based on community needs." I leaned forward. "And does Jeff Lewis know about this board decision? Or did he suggest it?" The mention of my likely successor, a business-minded councilman who had announced his candidacy the moment I confirmed my retirement, caused Karen's head to snap up. Her momentary surprise told me everything I needed to know. "Jeff understands the importance of strong community organizations," she said carefully. "Unlike you, he sees the value in empowering HOAs rather than restricting them with outdated municipal codes." Now we were getting somewhere. "So Jeff promised you expanded HOA authority if you help deliver the neighborhood vote?" I stated, not bothering to phrase it as a question. Karen's silence was confirmation enough. She recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "The political landscape is changing, Dave. You'd be wise to adapt rather than obstruct. Your retirement could be very comfortable if you're seen as a team player, or quite difficult if you make enemies of the next administration." I stood up slowly, maintaining eye contact. "Is that a threat, Karen?" She smiled thinly. "Consider it friendly advice from one community leader to another. If you pursue this, Jeff and I will ensure your exit from office is remembered for all the wrong reasons. No ceremonial keys to the city, no park benches with your name on them, just a bitter old man who couldn't accept change." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words. "You know, I've been in politics long enough to recognize when someone's overplaying their hand. You and Jeff might think you've got this all figured out, but here's some friendly advice in return. I may be retiring, but I'm still the mayor, and unlike you, I actually understand the law." I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing. I expect those cars off my property by sunset, or I'll have them all towed at the HOA's expense." Karen's face flushed with anger as she called after me. "You're making a mistake, Dave. When Jeff takes office, you'll regret this." I didn't bother turning around as I replied, "We'll see who has regrets when this is over, Karen." Walking out of that office, I felt a strange mix of irritation and invigoration. After months of wrapping up projects and preparing to pass the torch, it felt oddly satisfying to have a fight worth fighting again. If Karen and Jeff thought they could use my retirement as an opportunity to bend the rules, they were about to learn a painful lesson in civic governance. First thing Tuesday morning, I headed to City Hall, a place that had been my second home for 8 years. The familiar scent of old books and coffee greeted me as I made my way to my office, nodding to staff members who seemed surprised to see me so early. My retirement plans had allowed me a more relaxed schedule lately, but that luxury would have to wait. I needed my most trusted ally, Sally Peterson, my executive assistant whose legal knowledge often surpassed that of our city attorneys. I found her already at her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through the day's correspondence. "Sally," I said, closing the door behind me, "we have a situation." Her eyebrows rose slightly at my serious tone. Sally had been with me since my first campaign, and she could read my moods better than anyone. "Must be serious if you're here before 9 and using your mayor voice," she remarked, setting aside her work. "What's happened?" Over the next 20 minutes, I laid out the entire situation: Karen's parking scheme, the confrontation at the HOA office, and my suspicions about Jeff Lewis's involvement. Sally listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in her precise handwriting. When I finished, she removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. "So our HOA president is running an illegal parking operation on your private property, likely to curry favor with Councilman Lewis for when he presumably takes office. And you want to shut it down without creating a political firestorm 6 months before your retirement?" Her summary was succinct as always. "That's about the size of it," I confirmed, dropping into one of her visitor chairs. "I need to know exactly what legal grounds I'm standing on before this escalates further." Sally nodded and swiveled to her computer. "Let's start with the HOA bylaws they claim to be operating under. Did Karen mention a specific amendment?" I handed her a copy of the HOA regulations I'd obtained, with the relevant section highlighted. "Section 5, paragraph 12. It's a recent addition that wasn't properly filed with the city, which is the first red flag." Sally scanned the document, her frown deepening with each line. "This is extraordinarily vague, even by HOA standards. The association reserves the right to utilize exterior residential spaces for community benefit activities during designated hours, with proceeds allocated to approved neighborhood enhancement projects. There's no definition of exterior spaces, no specified process for designation, and no oversight mechanism for fund allocation." She looked up at me, her expression grim. "This wouldn't hold up in court for a second, but it's worded just ambiguously enough that they could claim they believed they were acting within their authority." I paced the small office, thinking through our options. We need to document everything, get statements from neighbors who were present, photographs of the signs and cars, copies of any advertising they did for this parking scheme. And I want to see their financial records. Where exactly is this money going? Sally was already typing rapidly, creating a to-do list. "I'll call Tom Johnson too. He lives across from you and has had his own run-ins with Karen. He mentioned something about questionable HOA special assessments at the last town hall." She paused, looking thoughtful. "You know, if Jeff Lewis is involved, this could constitute campaign finance violations. If HOA funds are being diverted to support his mayoral run, that's a serious ethics breach." The realization hit us both simultaneously. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. If Karen and Jeff were conspiring to use HOA resources for political purposes, we were looking at potential corruption that could affect the entire city. "We need to tread carefully," I cautioned. "Jeff has powerful backers, and making accusations without solid evidence could backfire spectacularly." Sally nodded in agreement, then suddenly froze, her eyes widening as she looked past me. I turned to follow her gaze just as something small and furry darted through the partially open door and made a beeline for my legs. Before I could react, an enthusiastic Yorkshire Terrier was jumping against my shins, tail wagging furiously. "Baxter, bad dog, come back here right now." A flustered city clerk appeared in the doorway, leash in hand and mortification on her face. "I'm so sorry, Mayor Kingston. My sister dropped him off unexpectedly and he slipped his collar when I took him for a quick walk." I bent down to pet the excited little dog, who responded by licking my hand enthusiastically. "No harm done. He's a friendly little guy." As I straightened up, my elbow caught Sally's coffee mug, sending it toppling across her desk and directly onto the stack of documents we'd been reviewing. Hot coffee spread across the papers, turning important bylaws and notes into a soggy brown mess. Sally jumped up with a startled cry, grabbing tissues to stem the flood while the clerk lunged forward to recapture Baxter, who seemed to think this was all part of a wonderful game. The chaos lasted only moments, but left Sally's desk in disarray and all three of us in various states of caffeination. As the clerk apologized profusely and retreated with the squirming Yorkshire Terrier, Sally surveyed the damage with a rueful expression. Then, unexpectedly, she burst into laughter. "Well," she said between chuckles, "at least it wasn't Karen charging in here." Her laughter was infectious, and I found myself joining in, the tension of the morning temporarily broken by the absurdity of the situation. "Can you imagine," I wheezed, "Karen with a clipboard instead of Baxter with a wagging tail?" Sally wiped tears of mirth from her eyes. "The dog is definitely preferable, and less likely to convert your office into a community resource without permission." As our laughter subsided, Sally's phone rang. Her expression turned serious as she listened to the caller, occasionally murmuring acknowledgments. When she hung up, her earlier humor had vanished. "That was Rachel from Community Development. The HOA has called an emergency meeting for this evening to discuss amendments to the community resource allocation procedures. My source on the board thinks they're going to try to retroactively authorize what they've done with your driveway and possibly expand to other properties." I checked my watch, calculating how much time we had to prepare. "Then we'd better get moving. Save what documents you can from the coffee deluge. We're going to need everything we've got for tonight's meeting." As I headed for the door, Sally called after me. "What's the plan exactly?" I paused, a slight smile forming despite the circumstances. "We're going to attend an HOA meeting, Sally, and give them a crash course in municipal law." The community center was packed by the time I arrived that evening. Word had spread about the emergency meeting, drawing a crowd that filled every chair with people standing along the walls. I spotted Sally near the back and Tom Johnson, my neighbor who had been fighting Karen's arbitrary rules for years, a few rows ahead. Karen stood at the front with several board members, looking displeased to see me. Beside her was Councilman Jeff Lewis, the presumptive mayor in waiting, working the room with practiced political charm. "Quite the turnout," I whispered to Sally as I took my seat. "People are curious about the sudden meeting," she replied. "And there are rumors about your driveway situation. Neighbors are worried about the precedent it sets. If the HOA can commandeer your property, whose home is safe?" Karen called the meeting to order, her voice carrying artificial warmth as she explained their innovative funding opportunities that had already generated $2,000 from the weekend parking initiative. "This kind of creative problem-solving is exactly what Oak Ridge needs, finding untapped resources within our community rather than increasing homeowner dues," she declared before introducing Jeff Lewis as a supporter of expanded HOA authority. Jeff stepped forward with his campaign smile. "As your next mayor, God willing, and with your support, I believe in empowering community organizations like our excellent HOA. My administration will work to remove unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles and give HOAs greater authority over community development." His carefully chosen words drew enthusiastic applause from board members, though many residents exchanged concerned glances. Karen then announced the main business: amendments to formalize their community resource utilization program that would allow the HOA to designate private spaces, driveways, lawns, even portions of backyards, for community use with appropriate compensation. This statement caused immediate pushback. "Are you saying the HOA could use my backyard without my permission?" one woman asked. "With compensation and only during reasonable hours," Karen replied with a tightening smile. Another resident challenged, "But who decides what's reasonable or what's fair compensation?" When Karen mentioned board oversight, he scoffed. "The same board raising fees while our streets have potholes? No thanks." Sensing the mood shift, Karen called on Jeff to smooth things over. Jeff painted a vision of lower fees and higher property values through voluntary participation in community enhancement. His emphasis on voluntary contradicted what happened to my property, prompting me to speak up. "What happened this weekend wasn't voluntary participation," I stated firmly. It was trespassing and unauthorized commercial activity. My driveway was converted into a paid parking lot without my consent, with HOA signage suggesting official approval. The amendment proposed tonight appears designed to retroactively authorize illegal actions. I explained to the residents that property rights are fundamental and no organization can appropriate private land for commercial purposes without permission, permits, insurance, and safety measures. Jeff countered that my position represented outdated thinking that stifles community initiative, suggesting homeowners should determine how their neighborhood functions. I held my ground. That's precisely my point, Councilman. Voluntary is the key word. What happened wasn't voluntary, it was imposed without consent. And while I appreciate your campaign promises, the law doesn't change based on who sits in the mayor's office. Karen's frustration showed as she suggested my impending retirement had left me out of touch with evolving community needs, a personal attack that drew gasps from attendees. Tom Johnson stood up in my defense. I've lived here 30 years and never seen an HOA take such liberties with property rights. If they can turn the mayor's driveway into a parking lot today, whose home will be voluntarily repurposed tomorrow? With momentum clearly shifting against them, Karen reluctantly announced they would postpone the vote pending further review. As people filed out, several thanked me for speaking up. That went better than expected, Sally observed. For now, I replied, watching Jeff continue campaigning despite the setback. But they won't give up easily. We need to find out where that parking money is really going. This isn't just about my driveway anymore. It's about protecting the community from unchecked power. The following day brought unexpected developments from an equally unexpected source. I was reviewing city budget projections with Sally when the receptionist buzzed to announce a visitor, Martha Evans, HOA treasurer and until now one of Karen's staunchest supporters on the board. Sally raised an eyebrow questioningly. Martha's part of Karen's inner circle. What could she want? I shrugged, equally puzzled. Let's find out. Send her in, I told the receptionist. Martha entered tentatively, clutching a large envelope to her chest. The woman who had confidently seconded every one of Karen's motions at HOA meetings for the past 3 years now looked nervous and out of place, her usual polish replaced by an air of distraction. Her tailored blazer was slightly wrinkled, and she'd missed a button, small details that spoke volumes about her current state of mind. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Mayor Kingston," she began, remaining standing even after I gestured to a chair. I'm not sure I should be here, but I don't know where else to turn." Her voice wavered slightly, and I recognized the signs of someone wrestling with their conscience. "Please, Martha, sit down," I said, using the calming tone I'd perfected during countless city crises. "Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you came." She sank into the chair, still clutching the envelope like a lifeline. Sally quietly closed her notebook and offered to get coffee, an excuse to give us privacy, but Martha shook her head. "She should stay. You'll both need to hear this." The gravity in her voice eliminated any remaining doubt that this was serious. Martha took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been the HOA treasurer for 3 years. I believed in what we were doing, improving the neighborhood, protecting property values, building community. Karen is persuasive. She convinced the board that a strong HOA meant a strong Oak Ridge, and I bought into that vision completely." She paused, collecting her thoughts. When she first proposed the Community Resource Utilization Program, it sounded innovative. The HOA budget has been stretched thin, and finding new revenue sources without raising fees seemed ideal. I never questioned the legality. Karen assured us the city would support it once Councilman Lewis took office. Martha's expression hardened slightly. What I didn't know then was that the program was targeting specific properties, starting with yours, without any owner notifications or consent procedures. That should have been my first red flag. She laid the envelope on my desk, her hand lingering on it momentarily before withdrawing. The second red flag came yesterday when I was reconciling the weekend's parking revenue. The amount collected, over $2,000 in cash, doesn't match what was deposited into the HOA account. Only $800 made it into our books. Sally leaned forward, her interest piqued. Where did the rest go? Martha's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. That's what I asked Karen. She said certain administrative costs had to be covered first, off the books. When I pressed for details, she became defensive, then threatening. She reminded me that as treasurer, my signature is on all the financial documents, including some creative accounting she's implemented over the past year. The implication was clear. Karen had maneuvered Martha into a position where she could be blamed for any financial irregularities. What's in the envelope, Martha? I asked gently. She pushed it toward me. Copies of everything. Bank statements, deposit slips, the handwritten ledger Karen keeps separate from our official records, and emails between Karen and Jeff Lewis discussing campaign support from community resources. I think they're using the HOA as a conduit to fund his mayoral campaign, disguising political contributions as legitimate neighborhood expenses. I opened the envelope and spread its contents across my desk, Sally moving closer to examine the document. The evidence was damning. A clear paper trail of misappropriated funds, with amounts diverted from various HOA projects into ambiguously labeled community outreach expenses that coincided perfectly with Lewis's campaign events. Why are you bringing this to me now? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Martha's eyes welled with tears. Last night, after the meeting, Karen was furious. She needed someone to blame for the backlash, and she chose me. Said I hadn't properly explained the financial benefits to residents. That's why they turned against the proposal. Then this morning, she called to tell me the board might need to conduct an audit of all HOA finances, strongly implying that if discrepancies were found, I would take the fall. She wiped away a tear that had escaped. I've worked in accounting for 20 years. My reputation means everything. I cannot and will not be her scapegoat, especially not for something that crosses ethical and legal lines. Sally had been silently reviewing the documents, her expression growing increasingly troubled. These contribution patterns would violate campaign finance laws if Jeff is accepting HOA funds without proper disclosure, and the misappropriation of HOA fees is a separate legal issue entirely. I should have questioned things sooner, but Karen has a way of making everything sound reasonable, legitimate, and those who ask too many questions tend to find themselves ostracized or worse. I understood Martha's position all too well. Small communities like HOAs could become perfect environments for the abuse of power, with social pressure and fear of retaliation keeping most people in line. What are you hoping will happen now, Martha? I asked, needing to clarify her expectations. She straightened in her chair, finding some reserve of determination. I want accountability. If I've been complicit in something illegal, I'll accept the consequences, but I won't be the only one. Karen and Jeff made these decisions, pressured board members, manipulated the system. They should bear the responsibility for their actions. I exchanged glances with Sally, a silent conversation passing between us based on years of working together. This evidence was exactly what we needed, but using it came with responsibilities toward Martha as well. We'll need your formal statement, I said carefully, and if this leads to official investigations, you may be called to testify. Martha nodded resolutely. I understand. I'll cooperate fully. Sally opened her laptop. I can take your statement now while the details are fresh in your mind. As Sally began documenting Martha's account, I examined the financial records more closely. The pattern was even more disturbing than I'd initially thought. The parking scheme at my property was just the tip of the iceberg. HOA funds had been systematically diverted for months, coinciding precisely with Jeff Lewis's unofficial campaign activities before his formal announcement. If these records were accurate, both Karen and Jeff had engaged in serious ethical breaches, possibly crossing into criminal territory. As Martha recounted dates, amounts, and conversations, her voice grew steadier, as if unburdening herself of these secrets was restoring her confidence. Nearly 2 hours later, with Martha's statement complete and copies made of all documents, Sally escorted her out with assurances of discretion and appreciation for her courage. When Sally returned, she found me staring thoughtfully at the evidence spread across my desk. "This changes everything," I said quietly. "It's not just about my driveway or even HOA overreach anymore. This is public corruption, Sally." She nodded grimly. "The question is how to proceed. Exposing a mayoral candidate's ethical violations 6 months before an election is a political thunderbolt, and the fallout will affect the entire city." I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of the situation. "We need to be strategic about this, make sure all our evidence is airtight before making any accusations public." Sally nodded in agreement. "I'll have our legal team review everything discreetly. If we're moving forward with official action, we need to be certain we're on solid ground." As Sally gathered the documents, I found myself staring at the final page. A bank statement showing a substantial transfer from the HOA account to a marketing consultancy that, according to Martha, was a shell for campaign activities. Karen really thought she could get away with this, I mused. She saw my retirement as an opportunity, never considering I might fight back. Sally paused, a slight smile on her face. "People often mistake your diplomatic approach for weakness. It's a miscalculation Karen is about to regret deeply." I returned her smile, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's make sure of that. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about protecting the integrity of our city government and the rights of every homeowner in Oak Ridge." The next few days passed in a blur of strategic planning and careful documentation. Sally and I worked with Martha to compile a comprehensive record of Karen and Jeff's misconduct, ensuring every allegation was supported by multiple pieces of evidence. We operated with utmost discretion, knowing that premature exposure could give our opponents time to cover their tracks or spin the narrative. I had just finished reviewing the final report when my phone rang. The editor of the Oak Ridge Gazette, our local newspaper. "Mayor Kingston," he began without preamble, "I've received some concerning information about your recent conflict with the Homeowners Association. Would you care to comment before we go to press?" My grip tightened on the phone as I processed what this meant. Karen and Jeff were making preemptive moves, attempting to control the story before we could act. "What exactly have you heard, Dan?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral while gesturing to Sally to come closer. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We've received documents suggesting you've been using your position to obstruct legitimate community initiatives because of personal grievances with the HOA leadership. There are implications that you're attempting to sabotage Councilman Lewis's campaign by manufacturing controversy." I almost laughed at the audacity of the accusation. They were flipping the script entirely, casting themselves as victims of mayoral overreach. It was a clever move, I had to admit. "That's a serious allegation, Dan. I hope you're planning to thoroughly verify these documents before publishing anything." The editor assured me they were still investigating, which gave me a small window of opportunity. "I'd like to meet with you today if possible. There's another side to this story that you should be aware of before moving forward." After arranging a meeting for that afternoon, I turned to Sally, who had been listening to my side of the conversation. "They're trying to get ahead of this, painting me as a vindictive lame duck mayor using my power to settle personal scores." Sally nodded grimly. Classic deflection strategy. "If they can make this about you versus them, rather than their actual misconduct, they might sway public opinion, especially with Jeff's campaign resources behind the narrative." I paced the office, considering our options. We had planned to present our evidence to the City Ethics Committee next week after thorough legal review, but Karen and Jeff's preemptive strike forced our timeline. "We need to accelerate our plan," I decided. "Contact Martha. We'll need her ready to go on record sooner than expected. And let's get copies of the financial evidence to Dan at the Gazette." The next several hours were a frenzy of activity. Sally arranged an emergency meeting with our city attorney to ensure our disclosure to the press wouldn't compromise any potential legal proceedings. I called Tom Johnson and several other neighbors who had witnessed the parking scheme firsthand, securing their agreement to provide statements. By the time I walked into Dan's office at the Gazette that afternoon, I carried both metaphorical and literal ammunition, a folder containing bank statements, email exchanges, and Martha's notarized testimony. Dan's expression shifted from professional skepticism to genuine shock as I laid out the evidence piece by piece. "This goes well beyond an HOA dispute," he said, examining a particularly damning email exchange between Karen and Jeff discussing how to reallocate community funds to support campaign activities without triggering reporting requirements. "The parking situation at my home was just a symptom of a much larger problem," I explained. "Karen Smith has been systematically misappropriating HOA funds with Councilman Lewis's knowledge and support, using community resources to fuel his mayoral campaign while bypassing campaign finance laws." Dan leaned back in his chair, digesting the implications. "These are serious allegations against a leading mayoral candidate, Mayor Kingston. We'll need to give Councilman Lewis and Ms. Smith an opportunity to respond." I nodded, having expected this. "Of course, journalistic integrity demands it. All I ask is that you review the evidence thoroughly and give this story the attention it deserves, regardless of political pressure you might face." Dan's expression grew serious. The Gazette has never shied away from holding power accountable, regardless of who wields it. As I left the newspaper office, I felt simultaneously relieved and anxious. The truth would soon be public, but Karen and Jeff wouldn't go down without a fight. My phone confirmed the suspicion almost immediately, lighting up with a message from Jeff Lewis. "Big mistake, Dave. You had a chance to exit gracefully. Now we'll see how the public reacts when they learn their mayor is sabotaging his successor out of spite." I didn't bother responding to the threat, instead calling Sally to update her on the meeting. "Dan seemed convinced by the evidence," I told her. "Expect the Gazette to reach out to Karen and Jeff for comment soon. Things will move quickly from here." Sally's voice was tense with anticipation. "I've just heard from Martha. Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting for tonight. They're likely planning damage control." That evening, local news stations picked up on the brewing controversy, though they reported only vague details about allegations of impropriety involving the HOA and the mayoral race. Jeff Lewis's campaign quickly issued a statement denouncing desperate tactics by establishment figures resistant to change. Without addressing any specific accusations, Karen remained uncharacteristically silent, which concerned me more than any public statement might have. Silent Karen was plotting Karen, and I suspected she wasn't finished yet. My suspicions were confirmed the next morning when Sally called me earlier than usual, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to see today's Gazette, and then you should probably turn on Channel 5 News." The Gazette's headline was exactly what we'd hoped for: "President and mayoral candidate accused of financial misconduct." The article detailed the evidence we'd provided, including quotes from Martha and documentation of the misappropriated funds. It was thorough, factual, and damning. Channel 5 News, however, was running a very different story. Jeff Lewis stood before a crowd of supporters, looking appropriately somber as he addressed baseless accusations designed to undermine community leadership. Behind him stood several HOA board members, though notably not Martha, nodding in agreement as he spoke. "What we're witnessing is the desperate flailing of an administration that has failed to address neighborhood concerns for years," Jeff declared, his voice carrying the practiced indignation of a politician on the defense. "Mayor Kingston has chosen to attack dedicated community volunteers rather than acknowledge his own shortcomings." The camera cut to Karen, who had clearly prepared for her moment in the spotlight. Gone was her usual imperious demeanor, replaced by an expression of wounded dedication. "All I've ever wanted was to improve our neighborhood," she said, her voice catching slightly as if holding back emotion. "To be accused of wrongdoing for trying to create innovative solutions to community challenges is deeply hurtful. The mayor's vindictive actions show exactly why Oak Ridge needs new leaders." The performance was masterful. Karen as the victimized community servant, Jeff as the champion stepping in to defend neighborhood values against an overreaching government official. They had effectively reframed the narrative, turning evidence of their misconduct into a political attack story. I watched the coverage with a mixture of frustration and admiration for their tactical skill. They'd moved quickly to rally their base, knowing that many viewers would form opinions based on the emotional appeal rather than waiting for all facts to emerge. "They're good," I admitted to Sally when she arrived at my office, the morning papers spread across my desk alongside printouts of online coverage, "but they've made a critical mistake." Sally raised an eyebrow questioningly. "They're doubling down on the story that everything they did was legitimate and above board, including the parking operation on my property, which means they're not backing away from their actions, just recasting the motivations." Sally caught my meaning immediately, a slow smile spreading across her face. "So if we can definitively prove their actions were illegal, their entire defense collapses?" I nodded, reaching for the phone. "It's time to stop playing defense. Call the city attorney and the police department. I want to discuss options for dealing with unauthorized commercial activity on private property and potential misappropriation of funds." As Sally made the calls, I turned back to the television where Jeff Lewis was still holding forth about community empowerment and bureaucratic obstruction. His confident expression betrayed no concern about the storm that was about to break over his campaign. But then again, the best counterattacks were the ones your opponent never saw coming. I spent the remainder of that day in meetings with city officials reviewing laws and regulations that applied to our situation. By evening, I had a clear plan of action backed by municipal code and state law. As mayor, I had always been careful not to use my position for personal matters, maintaining a strict separation between my role as a public official and my status as a private citizen. But this situation had crossed that line when Karen and Jeff turned a private property dispute into a public corruption issue. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful Saturday that found me standing in my driveway beside Police Chief Roberts and a city code enforcement officer. Once again, my property had been transformed into an impromptu parking lot overnight, with Karen signs prominently displayed and a small table set up where an HOA volunteer collected fees from drivers. "Is this sufficient documentation of the unauthorized activity?" I asked the code enforcement officer, who was photographing the signs and taking notes. He nodded grimly. "Commercial operation in a residential zone without permits, no safety measures in place, no insurance documentation. This violates at least 6 different city ordinances." Chief Roberts surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "And you've confirmed this is being conducted without your consent as the property owner?" I nodded. "Absolutely. I've made my objections clear to Ms. Smith multiple times, both verbally and in writing." The chief checked his watch. "Then I believe we have everything we need to proceed." At my signal, 3 police cruisers that had been waiting around the corner pulled onto my street, lights flashing. Behind them came 2 tow trucks. The HOA volunteer at the payment table looked up in alarm, fumbling for his phone. Within minutes, Karen Smith's car screeched to a halt at the curb, and she emerged looking flustered for the first time since this conflict began. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching toward us with clipboard in hand. I remained calm, letting Chief Roberts take the lead as we had discussed. "Ms. Smith, we're responding to complaints about unauthorized commercial activity and trespassing," he explained professionally. "These vehicles are parked illegally on private property without the owner's consent." Karen's face flushed with anger as she gestured wildly at her clipboard. "This is an approved HOA activity. We've been fully transparent about our community fundraising initiative." The code enforcement officer stepped forward. "Ms. Smith, commercial parking operations require proper permits, which you don't have. Furthermore, you need the property owner's permission, which you also don't have." Karen turned to me, eyes blazing. "This is your doing. You're abusing your position to harass community volunteers." I maintained my composure, keeping my voice level. "No, Karen. I'm a private citizen whose property rights are being violated, and the city is responding to that violation as they would for any resident. The fact that I'm the mayor doesn't exempt you from following the law." By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch the confrontation. Among them was Tom Johnson, who had been instrumental in documenting the previous weekend's parking scheme. The tow truck operators had begun their work, attaching the first vehicle for removal. Karen's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't do this! These people paid to park here!" Chief Roberts remained impassive. "Then you'll need to refund their money, Ms. Smith. The vehicles are being towed to the municipal lot where owners can retrieve them without charge since they parked here under false pretenses." Karen's phone rang, and she answered it while glaring daggers at me. From her expression and the way she stepped away for privacy, I could tell it was Jeff Lewis on the line, likely having heard about the commotion. The scene grew increasingly chaotic as car owners returned to find their vehicles being towed, demanding explanations from Karen, who struggled to maintain control of the situation. The HOA volunteer had wisely disappeared, taking the cash box with him. As the first tow truck pulled away with an expensive SUV in tow, Karen ended her call and stormed back to where I stood with the officers. "Jeff says you'll regret this," she hissed, low enough that only I could hear. "This isn't just about parking anymore. You've declared war on the wrong people." I met her gaze steadily. "No, Karen, you declared war when you decided the rules didn't apply to you. I'm just ensuring they do." As the morning progressed, all the vehicles were towed and the unauthorized parking operation dismantled. The code enforcement officer issued Karen citations for multiple violations, explaining that fines would be assessed against the HOA. Throughout the process, she alternated between threatening legal action and attempting to rally neighbors to her cause, but the mood of the crowd had shifted perceptibly. Many who had initially been confused or angry about the towing grew supportive once they understood the situation, particularly when Tom and other neighbors shared their own experiences with Karen's increasingly autocratic HOA leadership. By early afternoon, news crews had arrived, capturing footage of the last cars being towed and conducting interviews with residents. I gave a brief factual statement explaining that this was a simple matter of enforcing existing regulations that protected private property rights and ensured proper permits for commercial activities. When asked about the broader allegations regarding HOA funds and campaign finance issues, I directed reporters to the documentation already in the public record, emphasizing that today's enforcement action was separate from those concerns. Karen refused to speak on camera, retreating to her car while making angry phone calls. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, her flustered, defensive demeanor versus my calm, measured responses. As the excitement died down and the crowds dispersed, Sally joined me on my now empty driveway. "Well, that escalated quickly," she remarked dryly. "Effective, though. The visual of all those cars being towed makes the point in a way that legal documents never could." I nodded, surveying my property with satisfaction. "Sometimes you need to take decisive action to break through the noise. Karen and Jeff have been controlling the narrative by making this sound complicated. A dispute about community resources and HOA authority. Today makes it simple. They took something that wasn't theirs to take, and there are consequences for that." Sally checked her phone, scrolling through news alerts. "The story's already trending locally. Channel 5 is leading with it for the evening news, and the Gazette has updated their online coverage with photos of the tow trucks." She looked up with a slight smile. "Also, Martha called. Apparently 3 more HOA board members have reached out to her wanting to provide statements about Karen's financial maneuvers. They're jumping ship." I wasn't surprised. Once the tide turns in small-town politics, it often turns completely. Those who had enabled Karen's overreach were now scrambling to distance themselves, particularly as legal consequences loomed. My phone rang, Jeff Lewis's number flashing on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but decided a direct conversation was overdue. "Councilman?" I answered neutrally. His voice came through tense with barely controlled anger. "You've gone too far, Dave. Towing those cars was a political stunt that hurt innocent residents." I remained calm. "Those innocent residents were misled by the HOA into parking illegally on private property. They've been allowed to retrieve their vehicles without charge, which is more consideration than Karen showed when she appropriated my driveway without permission." There was a pause before Jeff responded, his tone shifting to something more calculating. "This vendetta of yours is damaging the entire community. If you had concerns about HOA operations, there are proper channels to address them. You mean like the channels Karen and you used to divert HOA funds to your campaign? I asked pointedly. Or perhaps the proper channel would have been asking my permission before turning my property into a commercial venture. Jeff's response was immediate and defensive. Those allegations about campaign funds are completely baseless. Karen may have been overzealous about the parking initiative, but everything else is just political mudslinging from someone who can't accept that his time is ending. I almost pitied him in that moment. Either Karen hadn't told him the full extent of what Martha had revealed, or he truly believed they could weather this storm through sheer denial. The bank records don't lie, Jeff. Neither do the emails between you and Karen discussing how to repurpose HOA funds for your campaign events. The evidence is already with the Ethics Committee and the District Attorney's office. The silence that followed told me everything. He hadn't known Martha had provided documentation that explicit. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its confident edge. This isn't over, Dave. You've made this personal, and you'll regret that decision. The line went dead before I could respond. I turned to Sally, who had been listening to my side of the conversation. Jeff just realized how much trouble he's actually in, I told her. Expect them to get desperate? Sally nodded gravely. Desperate people make mistakes. Let's make sure we're ready to document them when they do. As evening fell, and I finally had a moment of quiet reflection, I found myself standing at my living room window, looking out at my now empty driveway. The day's events had been satisfying but exhausting. This conflict had grown far beyond a simple property dispute, evolving into something that would likely end political careers and possibly result in criminal charges. I felt no pleasure in that prospect, just a weary determination to see it through to its proper conclusion. The principles at stake, respect for law, ethical governance, basic property rights, were too important to compromise, regardless of personal cost. My phone chimed with a news alert from the Gazette. Exclusive. More HOA board members come forward with allegations against Smith. Karen's carefully constructed fiefdom was crumbling, brick by brick. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she and Jeff fought to salvage their positions, but tonight at least, justice had taken a significant step forward. Martha, your courage in speaking up made all the difference. As I walked home that evening, enjoying the crisp fall air and the familiar sights of the neighborhood I'd served for so long, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me for months. My retirement was just weeks away now, but unlike the passive transition I'd envisioned, I would be leaving office having reaffirmed the principles that had guided my administration from the beginning. Sometimes standing firm on matters of principle meant standing alone, at least temporarily, but in the end, truth and justice had a way of gathering their own momentum. The epilogue to this story came in unexpected forms over the following weeks. The HOA underwent a complete restructuring, with new bylaws emphasizing transparency and homeowner input. Jeff Lewis withdrew completely from public life, his political aspirations apparently shelved indefinitely after his plea agreement became public. Karen Smith put her house on the market and, according to neighborhood gossip, planned to relocate to another state. The parking scheme that had started it all became something of a local legend, referenced half-jokingly whenever someone overstepped their authority. Careful, or the mayor will have your car towed. On my final day in office, as I cleaned out my desk and prepared to hand over the reins to a newcomer who had emerged as a reform candidate in the wake of Lewis's implosion, Sally presented me with a small, gift-wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph of my driveway, empty and peaceful in the morning light. Attached was a handwritten note. Sometimes the most important fights are the ones that happen closest to home. I laughed, placing the frame on my bare desk. Truer words were never spoken. As I left City Hall for the last time as mayor, I was surprised to find Tom Johnson waiting beside my car, holding a leash attached to a familiar Yorkshire Terrier. Baxter? I questioned, recognizing the little dog that had caused chaos in Sally's office months earlier. Tom nodded with a slight smile. My sister couldn't keep him anymore, thought you might want some company in retirement. He's already proven he has good political instincts. The little dog wagged his tail enthusiastically, apparently recognizing me as well. I knelt down to pet him, surprised by how fitting this conclusion felt. "Well, Baxter, what do you say to long walks and no HOA drama?" His excited yip seemed answer enough. The path to justice had been neither straight nor easy, but standing there with a new companion at my side and the satisfaction of leaving my community better than I found it, I couldn't help but feel that every difficult step had been worthwhile. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you choose, but the ones that find you when you least expect them. And sometimes, standing up for what's right in your own driveway can make all the difference in the world. If you've enjoyed this true story of neighborhood justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life accounts of standing up to those who abuse their power. Remember, no Karen is too powerful when you know your rights and have the courage to defend them.